Welcome, I am Hatman of course, and today I want to talk a little bit more about this Brian Norman situation with him ostensibly ducking the Boots Ennis fight, turning down several offers from Eddie Hearn. Now Norman's manager has come out and claimed that they didn't overprice themselves. Bear in mind they were asking for something like $2.2 million. So let's just break this down. For Boots Ennis' last fight, he got something like $3 million. Let's assume that he's on some type of guarantee, and we'll use that as the figure, $3 million. Boots Ennis is not a big star. Eddie Hearn wants to make him into one, but right now he's not. So in order to make his shows profitable whilst paying him that type of guarantee, they're gonna need to be budgeted very carefully. For Brian Norman's last fight, he apparently got something like 100 grand. Clearly, there is a massive difference in the commercial value of Boots Ennis compared to Brian Norman. It's not even remotely close. Now, Brian Norman has picked up a belt, so that's going to increase his commercial value to some extent, but certainly not to have parity with Boots Ennis. Literally nobody knows who Brian Norman is outside of extremely hardcore boxing circles. So you're certainly not going to give him 50-50 because it doesn't make sense for the show commercially. If you give Brian Norman 50-50 against Boots Ennis, you're going to be doing a horrible loss. So he was first offered apparently 750 grand, which is something like 7 times his previous highest purse. Now, as far as I'm concerned, that's a perfectly reasonable first offer for a fighter as unknown as Brian Norman. And I suspect that was the best offer Matchroom could make whilst preserving Boots Ennis' guarantee. And the reason I say this is because Eddie Hearn has come out and claimed that their subsequent offers to Brian Norman, which were improved offers, were contingent on Boots Ennis reducing his own purse. Their final offer to Brian Norman was 1.75 million. And so if Ennis was on a 3 million guarantee, in order to bump Norman's purse up from 750 grand to 1.75 million, then Ennis would have had to have given up $1 million of his purse, 1/3 of it. So he would have been getting about 2 million, with Norman getting about 1.75 million. So that's what, a 55-45 split, 60-40, something like that. So Boots Ennis and Matchroom were willing to compromise in the negotiation and actually pay Brian Norman way above his commercial value, way above. But that wasn't good enough for Brian Norman. His manager has come out and said that they only wanted what was fair. According to them, 2.2 million is fair. What brand of crack are they smoking? 2.2 million? So that would have meant that Brian Norman would be getting paid more money than Boots Ennis. Again, within the confines of a budget. You got Brian Norman's manager claiming that Matchroom and DAZN don't want to invest in Boots Ennis. If they did, they'd be willing to put up the money that Brian Norman wants for the fight. Matchroom and DAZN are paying Boots Ennis $3 million a fight. That is the investment. What are you talking about? They're taking a massive risk paying Boots Ennis that type of money. You do realize that, don't you? Boots Ennis has done nothing in his career up to this point to show that $3 million fight purses are even sustainable for him. So they're taking a gamble giving him that type of money that they can actually increase his market value. That is the investment. If you believe in your guy, and if Brian Norman believes in himself, as a champion, why on earth would you not take the fight? What, because you want to try and build it up? Boots Ennis ain't going to stick around at 147, so you're not building anything up. Instead, Brian Norman wants to go off and get whatever, 200 grand a fight, making title defenses against unknowns. He wants to play it safe. Boots Ennis could have played it safe. He could have milked his belt against unknowns and not tried to engage in unifications. But instead, he's tried to make several unifications with Stanionis and now with Brian Norman, compromising on his own purse, on his own guarantee, potentially. And these guys who are nowhere near as big a names as he is are not willing to compromise. And somehow Ennis and Hearn are in the wrong? These guys don't really believe they can beat Boots Ennis. That's what it comes down to as far as I'm concerned. Simple. You know, if you look at Alexander Usyk as the gold standard, as far as how a champion should conduct themselves, moves up from cruiserweight, challenges AJ, beats him twice, makes multi-millions in those fights, particularly in the rematch, made big money, tries to unify with Tyson Fury, and he's willing to take a massive pay cut, even though he's got several belts and he's already taken down the biggest cash cow in the division at that time, beating him twice. Everyone now knows his name, and yet he was willing to take a pay cut from the second AJ fight against Tyson Fury. Accepted 30% when he's just beaten the biggest cash cow and he's got 3 belts. That's what a champion acts like when they really want to fight. They're willing to compromise, even to a point where the other side's actually taking the mick, taking the biscuit, being unreasonable. Brian Norman, of course, is not even in the same universe as Alexander Usyk in terms of achievement, in terms of notoriety, commercial value, anything like that. He certainly wasn't willing to take 30% against Boots Ennis. He wanted basically more than 50%. He wanted like 53, 54%. This guy's a joker. You see, what seems to have happened in the United States is a lot of fighters and managers and people in the game seem to think that Eddie Hearn has an unlimited money supply, because when he first launched in the US with DAZN, they were paying people like Tevin Farmer millions of dollars for title defenses. But that overspending by DAZN was being done at a time when Showtime and HBO was still in the market. DAZN were trying to establish themselves as a broadcaster. They were trying to build a stable of fighters. They were trying to build a rapport with the public, gain public confidence. In order to achieve all that, they had to spend a lot of money. But since that time, HBO have gone, Showtime have gone, PBC seem to be hanging on by a thread at the moment with this Amazon deal, and you've still got ESPN. DAZN are in a much stronger position now than they were when they first launched in the US. Therefore, they don't need to overspend to the extent that they used to. And bear in mind, a few years ago, I did a video about this at the time. Len Blavatnik, the guy who owns DAZN, had to bail the company out to the tune of something like 3 or 4 billion of his own money. Obviously, and I said this at the time again, Len Blavatnik doesn't want to have to keep doing that. He wants the business to become profitable and sustainable. So he was obviously going to tighten the purse strings. The days of frivolous spending are long gone. Occasionally, they might want to overpay for certain fighters or certain fights, but in the main, they want to pay what they think fights are actually worth. They're trying to run a business, but a lot of other people in the American boxing community don't seem to have got the memo on that. Furthermore, because of Eddie Hearn's association with the Saudis, they may think that that's another bottomless budget for Eddie Hearn to dip into at his will. It's not. The Saudis aren't interested in every single fight. They're interested in certain fights. The Saudi coffers are not open for Eddie Hearn to dip into willy-nilly. Again, this is something which is apparently being overlooked by many people in America. Eddie Hearn, for most of his shows that don't have Saudi involvement, he's on a strict budget. This is one of the reasons that Eddie Hearn loses so many purse bids, because he doesn't want to go beyond his budget. So getting back to Brian Norman, paying Brian Norman $2.2 million is absolutely insane. Brian Norman's team, there must be somebody in there that knows it's insane. Bob Arum certainly knows it's insane. That's Brian Norman's promoter. He knows it's completely nuts to be paying Brian Norman that amount of money. Why would you lose so big on a show for somebody else's fighter? It's not like Brian Norman is signed to Eddie Hearn. And again, going back to a point I made earlier on, Ennis and Hearn were willing to compromise. They were willing to cut down Ennis's purse in order to boost Norman's purse, all the way up to 1.75 million. And somehow Brian Norman and his team turned it down. I mean, these people are jokers. He'll instead go off and defend his title for what, 200 or 300 grand or something? I was talking to somebody in my Element group about this situation, and he said, well, there's some type of clause apparently in Brian Norman's Top Rank contract whereby if he fights on a rival promoter's show, Top Rank take a bigger cut than normal. Well, even if that is the case, he'd still end up with more money taking the Boots Ennis fight than he's going to get for his next few fights on ESPN. And not only the money, but also the opportunity. If you truly believe you can beat Boots Ennis, you take the fight, you beat him, and then your purses go through the roof because all of a sudden everybody knows who you are now. As it stands, nobody knows who Brian Norman is. Another point that the guy in my Element group brought up was that David Avanesian was paid something like 750 grand to fight Boots Ennis last time up. And so the point he was making is that it shows it was a derisory offer. How could you offer a world champion the same initial purse that you paid David Avanesian, who was a late replacement opponent? Again, boxing purses are decided by your commercial value, and your commercial value is decided by how many people know you and are willing to pay to watch you fight. David Avanesian is far more well known than Brian Norman. Furthermore, Avanesian, as a late replacement opponent, was going to have to be overpaid to get him in the ring. Matchroom and Ennis wanted to save the show. A guy like Avanesian is not going to take the normal purse that you'd expect him to get for a fight like that, which might be half as much. He's not going to take it. In order for him to step in at the last minute, he's going to demand way above the odds. And so that's what they paid him, way above the odds, about 750 grand. A guy who's been around, who's fought Stanionis, who's fought Terence Crawford, far more well-known than Brian Norman. So no matter how you slice it, I just cannot see how the narrative that Brian Norman's team are pushing, that somehow Eddie Hearn's really difficult to negotiate with and he was lowballing them, I just cannot see how that narrative is valid at all. Boots was willing to cut down his purse by a third so that the split was something like 55-45. Norman's team were not willing to compromise at all, not even a little bit. Can you imagine the B side not even being willing to compromise a tiny bit? Absolutely ridiculous. Seriously, you're getting 100 grand a fight, you end up being offered 1.75 million, and it's still not enough for you. You want to push it even further than that. All that tells me is that you don't really want the fight. Simple. You do not think the risk of fighting Boots Ennis is worth the reward. Now, that's okay in principle, but you're a champion, for one, which makes it problematic. And for two, you're acting like you were lowballed. No, you weren't. 1.75 mil for a guy who's used to getting 100 grand a fight is not a lowball. In fact, you're being massively overpaid. 750 grand is a good purse, actually, for a guy who's coming from 100 grand a fight, who nobody knows. You wanted to push it a bit further? Okay. Ennis accommodated you by cutting down his own purse. And what did you do, Brian Norman? Did you compromise at all? No. And yet his team have got the audacity to make out as though it was Team Ennis who were being unreasonable. That's just unreal. And you got Stanionis, who's with PBC, doing something similar. They still seem to be living in 2019 or something, when DAZN was still paying silly money. Now, another point that was raised by the guy I was chatting to in the Element group is that Eddie Hearn's just signed Shakur Stevenson, and they're apparently paying him loads of money, and he's boring as hell. Well, first of all, Shakur Stevenson is far more well-known and far more well-established, far more accomplished than Brian Norman. I mean, they're not even in the same universe as far as public profile and commercial value. Secondly, the Saudis are clearly involved in the Shakur Stevenson Matchroom situation. How do I know that? Because Shakur Stevenson's first fight under Matchroom is in Saudi Arabia on a Riyadh season card. In the past, Eddie Hearn spoke about how Shakur Stevenson was actually being overpaid by his previous promoter, Top Rank. And Bob Arum actually spoke to this. He revealed a conversation that he had with Eddie Hearn at a show they were both at. Bob Arum revealed what he was paying Stevenson, and Eddie Hearn said, apparently, I wouldn't pay him that much myself. Words to that effect. But presumably, he is being paid that much under this new deal or more. But again, the Saudis are involved in it. If the Saudis really wanted Boots Ennis versus Brian Norman, then maybe Brian Norman could get his 2.2 million. But ostensibly, they're not interested in that fight. So you need to temper your expectations accordingly. Anyway, it is what it is. As far as I'm concerned, this is a duck by Brian Norman. I think his team are a bunch of jokers with the nonsense they're coming out with. Got his dad talking rubbish, his manager talking rubbish, acting like Eddie Hearn's lowballing them. The reality is, America is a very tough boxing market. Very few fighters are making any money, especially non-Latino fighters. If you're a Mexican or some other type of Latino, you stand a much better chance of making some serious bread. But if you're not Latino, you're probably gonna struggle, even if you're a world champion, to make multi-millions. Stanionis is an American-based fighter. He's WBA welterweight champion. How much money do you think he's gonna get for his next fight? You think it's gonna be in the millions? People, this guy would be doing extremely well to get 500 grand for a standard title defense. The welterweight division does not have any stars. Ennis is not even a star at this point. So you have to temper your purse expectations accordingly. There's no stars out here at 147 anymore. So you can't expect to just be paid like a star because you got a belt. You have to be willing to compromise. Boots Ennis, to his credit, and Matchroom were willing to do that in negotiations with Brian Norman. Norman wasn't willing to do it. Stanionis apparently unwilling to compromise, acting like some type of diva. I mean, what has gotten into these guys' heads? Like, seriously. It looks like Boots Ennis might even move up rather than deal with these jokers at 147 because they're not serious. And funny enough, that might actually leave an opportunity for contenders like Conor Benn, if he can sort out his issue with the British board in UCAD, to pick up a belt. Now, I'm not saying he will pick up a belt, but I don't think the likes of Stanionis and Brian Norman are as good as Boots Ennis. Just my opinion. I give Conor Benn a much better chance against the remaining champions than I give him against Boots. So anyway, been talking far too long on this issue. Let me know what you guys think about it in the comment section below.